Have you ever wondered what truly exhausts you every day? It's not just the deadlines or the busy schedule. It's something quieter, more hidden. It's the constant pressure to know what's coming next, to map out your future, to define your identity, to predict how others will behave or how things will unfold. You work so hard to create a sense of control, but deep down, you still feel unsettled. Because some part of you knows the truth. Life doesn't follow your plans. Modern society teaches you that certainty is safety and that not knowing is weakness. But what if that belief is the very thing stealing your peace? What if chaos isn't the problem, but your resistance to it is? Michel de Montaigne, a French philosopher from the 16th century, faced this same question. While others clung to rigid systems and logical frameworks, he dared to turn inward. He didn't chase answers, he explored the questions themselves. And in doing so, he found something radical. Peace, not from control, but from acceptance. He discovered that real freedom doesn't come from knowing. It comes from no longer needing to know. And that's what this video is about. Not a method to master life, but an invitation to live it more honestly, to breathe a little deeper, to finally whisper the words that most of us are too afraid to say. I don't know, and that's okay. But of course, saying, I don't know, is one thing. Living with that uncertainty every single day is something else entirely. Most of us weren't taught how to be okay without answers. In fact, we were taught to fear that space between clarity and chaos, as if uncertainty itself was dangerous. But what if that discomfort is actually a doorway? What if it's not a problem to fix, but a path to explore? To understand how this mindset can truly shift your life, we need to look back, not just to your own experience, but to someone who lived centuries ago and yet, somehow, understood exactly what you're going through today. Have you ever felt like you were falling behind in a race you didn't sign up for? Like everyone around you seems so sure of their career, their goals, their values, while you're still figuring things out? That quiet pressure to have it all together isn't just modern, it's suffocating. You're expected to know who you are by 20, have a 5-year plan by 25, and settle into stability by 30. But deep down, you might suspect that life doesn't unfold that neatly. And you'd be right. Michel de Montaigne didn't pretend to have all the answers. Unlike the scholars of his time who sought to explain life through rigid systems and abstract theories, Montaigne took a radically different approach. He turned inward, not out of ego, but out of curiosity. He didn't write to instruct the world. He wrote to understand himself. His essays weren't blueprints for how to live. They were reflections of a man trying to make sense of his own humanity. Imagine this. While others were debating theology or politics in the public square, Montaigne was sitting alone in a quiet tower, surrounded by books and silence, asking himself, what do I really know? And more often than not, his answer was, not much. But instead of seeing that as a weakness, he saw it as freedom. You might think, what does that have to do with me? Well, think about how often you pretend to know, at work, in relationships, even with yourself. How often you nod along, offer opinions, or make decisions not from true understanding, but from fear of appearing lost. We live in a world where showing doubt is seen as failure. But Montaigne reminds us that doubt is not the enemy. It's a sign that you're still thinking, still learning, still alive. Take a real-world example. Maybe you're in a job that looks good on paper, but deep down, it doesn't feel right. You keep telling yourself it's just a phase, or it's secure, or you should be grateful. But beneath that narrative is an unspoken truth. You don't know if this path is really yours, and that not knowing eats at you, because you've never been taught how to sit with it. Montaigne would tell you, sit with it anyway, because the moment you admit, I don't know, is the moment your mind opens to what's possible. It's when you stop clinging to false clarity and start creating space for honest reflection. You begin to replace pressure with presence, performance with authenticity. And in that space, even without concrete answers, you start to feel a kind of peace. Not because everything makes sense, but because you finally gave yourself permission to stop pretending. Learning to live with uncertainty doesn't mean giving up. It means waking up. Most people believe that clarity will bring peace, but in reality, it's the obsession with clarity that creates most of the tension. When your mind is constantly racing to label every feeling, define every moment, and plan every outcome, you begin to lose the ability to simply live. Life becomes a performance. Every decision must be justified, every action explained, every emotion made rational. But life isn't a spreadsheet. It isn't a puzzle to be solved. And when you treat it that way, you turn your own existence into a problem. Michel de Montaigne never claimed to master life. What he mastered was the art of stepping back, of creating distance between thought and judgment. He allowed contradictions to exist without rushing to fix them. He made room for change instead of resisting it. And in doing so, he gave himself the space to grow without shame. That's not weakness, it's wisdom. Think of how often people stay in situations just because they fear the discomfort of not knowing what comes next. A toxic relationship, a draining job, a life path that no longer reflects who they are. They stay, not out of love or purpose, but because they can't bear the uneasiness of the unknown. They choose pain. They can predict over possibilities they can't control. But what Montaigne understood is that uncertainty is not always a threat. Sometimes, it's the invitation your soul has been waiting for. A friend once shared how he left a secure corporate role after 10 years. Not because he had a better offer, but because he realized he was losing himself in the routine. The months that followed were filled with doubt, confusion, and fear. Yet slowly, in the silence of not knowing, he began to rediscover what mattered. He explored new paths, reconnected with his creativity, and rebuilt a life that felt more like his. His peace didn't come from a guaranteed outcome. It came from trusting the space in between. If you're watching this, and you've been feeling stuck or anxious, maybe it's not because you've made the wrong choices. Maybe it's because you've been trained to fear the in-between. But the truth is, growth lives in that space. The space between who you were and who you're becoming. Between what was familiar and what is unknown. It's not a void, it's a transition. And you're allowed to be in it, without needing to rush through. Let this be a reminder that you don't need to resolve every emotion to move forward. You don't have to be certain to be brave. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stay soft in the middle of uncertainty and keep walking anyway. If this resonates with you, share a moment when uncertainty became a turning point in your life. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. The real turning point doesn't happen when life becomes clearer, but when you stop needing it to be. That shift begins the moment you no longer run from uncertainty, but learn to observe it. And observation, as simple as it sounds, is one of the most powerful tools you have. Montaigne understood this centuries ago. He wasn't just reflecting on life in a detached, philosophical sense. He was paying close attention to the rhythms of his mind, the contradictions of his beliefs, and the inconsistencies in his emotions. Instead of reacting, he paused. Instead of suppressing confusion, he gave it space. He didn't seek perfection. He sought understanding. In today's world, that kind of inner stillness feels almost impossible. We're constantly bombarded with information, opinions, pressure to perform, to decide, to move fast. There's no room to just be. But Montaigne reminds us that slowness is not weakness. It's clarity. When you step back from your assumptions and simply notice what's happening inside you, without judgment, you create a space where transformation can begin. Take, for example, how we often deal with failure. A project doesn't work out. A relationship falls apart. Instinctively, we label it as wrong or wasted. But what if it wasn't? What if that failure was exactly the disruption needed to reveal something deeper about your values, your needs, your blind spots? If you resist the discomfort, you miss the lesson. But if you stay with it, really sit in the unease, it becomes insight. That's what Montaigne practiced, not pushing feelings away, but tracing them back to their roots. This approach isn't about overthinking, it's about presence. And presence begins with honesty, being real with yourself, especially when you don't like what you see. It means noticing the tightness in your chest when someone criticizes you, the way your thoughts spiral at night, the subtle fear behind your need to plan every detail. Instead of covering those feelings up with productivity or distractions, Montaigne would say, write them down, sit with them, let them speak. One woman, who watched a previous video, wrote in and shared her experience of doing exactly this. After years of people-pleasing and hiding her uncertainty behind constant busyness, she began keeping a nightly journal, not filled with answers, just raw thoughts. At first, it was uncomfortable. But over time, she noticed patterns. How she was afraid of being seen as indecisive. How she judged herself harshly for not always feeling confident. How she'd been performing stability instead of building it. That awareness didn't fix her life overnight, but it gave her back something precious, permission to be human. That's what Montaigne offers us. He reminds us that we don't need to resolve every contradiction to live well. We don't need to be composed to be worthy. And most importantly, we don't need to fear the shifting nature of our own identity. You're not failing because you're changing. You're not broken because you're uncertain. You're evolving. Let that land. We live in a culture that celebrates decisiveness and punishes doubt. But there is wisdom in being slow to judge, in being curious rather than conclusive. Real growth rarely looks like clarity. It looks like confusion, discomfort, and moments when nothing seems to make sense. That's not a sign you're lost. It's a sign you're alive, awake, and paying attention. So if you're in that space right now, between what you used to believe and what you're not sure of anymore, don't rush through it. You don't have to label it, define it, or control it. You just have to stay with it. Observe, breathe, and trust that this too is part of the unfolding. Accepting uncertainty isn't just a mental exercise, it's a daily commitment. You can understand the concept, agree with the philosophy, and still feel lost when everything around you shifts. Because living with uncertainty means waking up each day without guarantees, without fixed answers, and still showing up for your own life anyway. That takes more strength than pretending to have it all figured out. Michel de Montaigne knew this well. He wasn't writing from a mountaintop of enlightenment. He wrote from real life, from illness, from political instability, from grief. His reflections were not abstract theories. They were tools for survival. For him, thinking wasn't just an intellectual act. It was a way to stay grounded in the middle of chaos. This is where philosophy becomes personal. When plans collapse, when relationships evolve, when the future doesn't unfold as you expected, this is where the real work begins. Not in controlling those outcomes, but in building an internal life that can hold space for change. A flexible inner world that doesn't panic every time reality moves in a different direction. One viewer once shared how she had to postpone her dream of studying abroad due to unexpected family illness. At first, she tried to control everything, create new timelines, force backup plans, distract herself with productivity, but nothing worked. What finally helped her breathe again wasn't a perfect solution. It was the moment she stopped fighting what was happening. She gave herself permission to feel disappointed, uncertain, unanchored. And slowly, that acceptance softened the fear. It didn't make things easier, but it made her stronger. This is what Montaigne teaches us, that we don't need to eliminate chaos from our lives. We need to learn how to stand inside it without collapsing. You don't need to be unmoved by change. You need to become someone who can move with it. It's not about passivity. It's about presence. When you stop demanding that life be stable, you start noticing the beauty in its motion, the way everything flows, adapts, renews itself. Your job isn't to stop the tide. It's to learn how to swim, not perfectly, but with awareness. And this awareness can be trained through small practices, like writing when you feel lost, not to fix the feeling but to understand it. like allowing silence at the end of the day, so your thoughts can settle instead of spiraling. Like checking in with yourself, not to analyze every detail, but simply to stay honest about what you're carrying. You don't need grand rituals, just a willingness to be gentle with yourself in uncertain moments. That gentleness builds resilience, and that resilience becomes your quiet foundation, the thing that doesn't break, even when everything else does. If you're someone who's always chasing clarity, maybe now is the time to give yourself permission to not know, not as a failure, but as a form of maturity. And if you've been here before, if you've already walked through a chapter of your life that didn't make sense until much later, feel free to share that in the comments. Someone else might need to hear it. Someone else might be standing where you once stood. And maybe now, after walking through all these reflections, through Montaigne's quiet courage, through the chaos you've been taught to resist, through the inner strength that comes not from control but from surrender, you're starting to feel it too, that a different way of living is possible. One where you stop demanding constant clarity and instead begin to trust the unfolding. Because uncertainty isn't something you conquer once and for all. It's something you learn to live with again and again. And with every moment you choose presence over panic, honesty over performance, softness over rigidity, you're practicing the very philosophy that Montaigne lived by. So before we close, let's pause, right here, between what was and what comes next. Let's gather what we've uncovered and carry it with us into the conclusion. So as we reach the end of this journey, take a breath. Not the kind of breath that marks a finish line, but the kind that reminds you you're still here, still becoming, still allowed to not have it all figured out. Because that's what Montaigne really left us, not a set of answers, but a way of being. A quieter, more flexible way of living that doesn't collapse when the future is unclear. A life where questions are not threats, but invitations. Where uncertainty isn't the enemy, but the beginning of something softer, more honest, more human. You don't have to wake up tomorrow with a perfect plan. You don't have to explain your doubts, justify your feelings, or hide your confusion. What you need, what you've always needed, is the courage to meet life as it is. Not with fear, but with curiosity, with presence, with compassion for the parts of you still unfolding. So wherever you are right now, in between jobs, between relationships, between identities, between moments of clarity, know this: you're not behind. You're in transition. And that's not a failure. That's life. If this video spoke to something in you, I invite you to carry its message into your own rhythm. Maybe today, you journal instead of force answers. Maybe you pause instead of fix. Maybe you stop holding your breath waiting for certainty and let yourself exhale into the unknown. And if you feel called, share your thoughts in the comments below. What's one area of your life where you're learning to let go of control? Your story might echo in someone else's heart. If you found value here, don't forget to like, subscribe to Channel Psychology Insights, and tap the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Because this isn't the end, it's the beginning of a deeper, freer way of living. One step, one breath, one brave moment at a time. Keep walking. You're doing just fine.